April 8th, 1943. 27 feet above Caen, France. The sky on that afternoon was so clear it looked etched into existence. Sunlight danced off Oberleutnant Ralph Hermachin's yellow-trimmed canopy. The landscape far below, a patchwork quilt, utterly removed from the violence that often erupted far above. He checked his left again, then right, reveling in the familiar pressure of the stick, the rippling vibration of the Focke-Wulf's engine, a melody that spoke of years in combat and hundreds of dogfights survived. Hermachin was not a superstitious man, but today he felt charmed. Even the radio chatter crackled with an uncharacteristic lightness. He grinned, wrist flicking in a mock toast to his wingman as the first American formation pushed into his field of view, thick and sluggish, straining against the blue like drunks climbing a hill. He saw them, ungainly, unfamiliar, a squadron of Republic P-47 Thunderbolts making their combat debut over occupied France. They looked comical. Bloated fuselages, blunt noses, the wings almost cartoonishly wide. Nothing like the sleek, knife-like silhouettes Hermachin thrilled to chase across the Channel or the Russian steppe. He hit his transmit button, laughter biting through his practiced composure. Die Amis haben uns fliegende Milchflaschen geschickt, he scoffed, knowing his voice would echo in the ears of young and old across Jagdgeschwader 26. The Americans are sending us flying milk bottles. His wingman replied with a snort, mocking the awkward shapes waddling over French farmland, and Hermachin felt his confidence grow. Clumsy, obviously overweight, these newcomers seemed to lumber rather than fly. The Luftwaffe, he believed, had little to fear. All the pilots he knew, every man who had clawed his way to ace status, shared this scorn. Yet, as the gap closed and the formations drew together, a different voice entered the story. A narrator who did not yet exist within Hermachin's world. The voice cut through the arrogance. That April afternoon, as Hermachin and dozens of German aces laughed, they were not watching a joke. They were witnessing the birth of the weapon that would, piece by unyielding piece, pulverize the very heart of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. No matter how loudly they mocked the pregnant cows and flying milk bottles, the storm had arrived, and thunder was its herald. Luftwaffe's golden generation. The men of Jagdgeschwader 26 were not simple pilots. They were survivors, veterans of 4 campaigns before their 25th birthdays. Hermachin, like his peers, had danced over Warsaw and dived on Spitfires above the Channel. His hands remembered the struggles above Tobruk and the desperate duels over Stalingrad's frozen earth. These pilots measured life in days, victories in single digits, and respect only for those who lived through winter after terrible winter. Every line of their combat doctrine was sharpened through necessity. German fighters, especially the beloved Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 109, were designed for rapid acceleration, immediate climb, and close-in, twisting battles. Energy, initiative, and reflexes won the day. They dismissed their enemies, not just the machines, but the men inside them, as clumsy and slow-witted. For years, the propaganda bore that out. Propaganda, a shield against doubt. Rumors buzzed through officers' messes and briefing shacks, reinforced by official bulletins and the thin smiles of staff officers. The P-47 Thunderbolt was fat, slow, unmaneuverable, a flying punchline. In Priller's words, echoed through wooden radios and over strong coffee, it flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow. Pilots rolled the names across their tongues. Fliegende Milchflasche, pregnant cow, Indiana. Targets so gracious even a rookie could score. The narrative was appealing. German pilots were world-class, obsessed with tactics, experts at eking out every last benefit from lightweight airframes, retraining each muscle memory to squeeze tight turns and slide into firing position. The Americans, by contrast, were fresh off the boat, novices with clean uniforms, no battle scars, no breathing room for the chaos of a sky at war. The numbers game. Hard facts, at first glance, seemed to support their confidence. The P-47, when parked on assembly fields, squatted like a beached whale. Empty. It weighed almost 10,000 pounds. Fully loaded, over 16,000. The German fighters Hermachin trusted hovered around 6,000 pounds, nimble by comparison. The Thunderbolt's redeeming factor, some conceded, was its magazine. 8 .50 caliber machine guns crammed into those battered wings could spit 3,400 rounds into the sky, almost 6,000 rounds per minute. Yet the Germans sneered. Those little MGs could never match the wallop of a 20mm cannon, even if their barrels glowed red-hot with overuse before running dry after just a minute of real combat. A F-190 or Bf-109 boasted 120 to 200 rounds of 20mm. It was enough, German doctrine claimed, to kill any enemy foolish enough to fly into range. Even the first field results offered reassurance to the Luftwaffe. During April alone, German pilots downed 14 P-47s at the cost of only 3 of their own. Jorns, laughter, and tradition held steady. But there was a darkness growing at the edges of this statistical comfort. The American factories roared endlessly. Even those first scattered flights hinted at an industrial logic the Luftwaffe's best minds could neither grasp nor answer. Republic Aviation's order books ran into the tens of thousands. Some whispered that soon there would be more flying milk bottles over France than clouds. What the Luftwaffe did not yet know was that these numbers, the ones they mocked, would soon deal death not just to planes, but to everything they had built, believed, and hoped to defend. June 26, 1943, 22,000 feet above the Pas de Calais. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson had been airborne for 93 minutes. His hands were steady on the stick, his focus split between the formation ahead and the fuel gauge ticking lower. The mission was routine: escort B-17s deep into German airspace, turn back before the fighters ran dry. Nothing about the morning suggested this would be the day that changed everything. Then the sky exploded. 4 Focke-Wulf 190s dropped from the sun like hunting falcons, their approach so perfectly timed that Johnson's wingman never saw them coming. The lead German, Wilhelm Ferdinand's Schwarm, veterans who hunted in packs, opened fire at 300 yards. The first burst missed. The second did not. Johnson felt the impacts before he heard them. A 20mm cannon shell punched through his left wing, tearing aluminum like paper. Another detonated against the armored headrest behind his skull, the shockwave rattling his teeth. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the canopy in crimson streaks, and somewhere deep in the fuselage, something caught fire. The Thunderbolt shuddered. Johnson's vision blurred as G-forces slammed him sideways. He tried to roll, tried to dive, tried anything to shake the predator locked onto his tail. The German pilot was relentless, methodical, professional. Another burst. This time, the canopy shattered. Glass fragments sliced across Johnson's face, drawing blood that mixed with sweat and terror. A shell fragment ricocheted off the instrument panel and buried itself in his right leg. He screamed, but the wind tore the sound away before it reached his own ears. The German closed to point-blank range. So close, Johnson could see the pilot's eyes through the smoke and chaos, could see the yellow nose spinner of the FW-190, could count the seconds until the next burst ended his life. And then the German opened fire again, and again, and again. Cannon shells walked across the Thunderbolt's fuselage like a butcher carving meat. The right wing buckled. The tail section absorbed 3 direct hits. Fire erupted behind the instrument panel, flames licking toward the cockpit. The canopy track welded itself shut from the heat, trapping Johnson inside a metal coffin, screaming toward the earth at 300 miles per hour. Johnson's hands moved on instinct, throttle back, mixture rich, trying to coax life from an engine that coughed black smoke and metal shavings. The controls barely responded. The rudder was gone. Half the aileron cables had snapped. He was flying a wreck held together by rivets and prayer. The German pilot pulled alongside. This moment, this exact instant, was where the myth died. The Luftwaffe ace stared at the Thunderbolt. Johnson could see his face clearly now, could read the expression shifting from confidence to confusion to something darker. The German had emptied his entire ammunition load, every 20mm shell, every machine gun round, into this fat American fighter. By every law of aerial combat, by every lesson learned over Poland and France and Britain, the P-47 should have been tumbling earthward in flaming pieces. But it flew. Battered, bleeding, burning. But it flew. The German pilot's eyes widened. He looked at his empty gun breeches, then back at the Thunderbolt, then at Johnson's blood-streaked face visible through the shattered canopy. For 3 seconds, the 2 men flew wingtip to wingtip, separated by 6 feet of air and an ocean of disbelief. Then the German peeled away, not to reposition for another attack, not to call in his wingmen. He simply left, diving toward the deck, his ammunition exhausted, and his worldview cracking like the canopy he'd just destroyed. Johnson nursed the Thunderbolt across the channel. Every minute felt like an hour. The engine temperature climbed into the red. Oil pressure dropped to nothing. The airspeed indicator was shattered, the altimeter spinning wildly, and he navigated by dead reckoning and desperation. When he finally coaxed the wreck onto the runway at RAF Manston, the ground crew counted the damage. 207 bullet and cannon holes. The canopy destroyed. The hydraulics obliterated. The right wing spar cracked in 3 places. Tail section held on by control cables and luck. Engine cylinders punctured. Fuel tanks riddled, but miraculously not ignited. Johnson climbed out on shaking legs, blood dripping from his face and leg, and looked back at what remained of his aircraft. It should have been impossible. By every calculation, every precedent, every lesson written in blood across 4 years of war, he should have been dead over France. But he wasn't, and when the combat report reached Luftwaffe intelligence headquarters in Berlin 3 days later, the analysts refused to believe it. The language they used was clinical, dismissive. Exaggerated claims typical of inexperienced American pilots. One staff officer scrawled in the margin, "No aircraft can absorb this punishment. Probable error in damage assessment." They were still laughing, but the laughter was becoming strained, forced, defensive. Doubt had entered the conversation like smoke under a door. The Tactical Revolution. July 1943. Somewhere over the Ruhr Valley. Colonel Hubert Zemke didn't need to read intelligence reports to understand what he had. He'd flown the P-47 for 6 months, had pushed it through dives that pulled the wings back and sent the airspeed needle past the red line. He knew what his fighter could do, and, more importantly, what it couldn't. The Thunderbolt would never outturn a Messerschmitt. It would never outclimb a Focke-Wulf in level flight. In a traditional dogfight, the kind romanticized in every aviation magazine and propaganda film, it was outmatched. So Zemke changed the rules. He gathered his pilots in a Quonset hut at Horsham St. Faith and drew a simple diagram on the chalkboard. "Forget everything you learned about dogfighting," he said, tapping the chalk against the board for emphasis. "We don't turn. We don't circle. We dive. We shoot. We climb back up. The Thunderbolt is a hammer. You don't swing a hammer in circles. You bring it straight down." The tactic was brutally simple. Maintain altitude advantage. Spot the enemy below. Dive at maximum speed. Fire a devastating burst. Then use the momentum to climb back to safety before the Germans could react. Boom and zoom. Slash and dash. Energy fighting refined to its purest form. It worked because the P-47 could do something no German fighter could match. It could dive faster than gravity wanted it to. In a vertical dive, with the throttle to the firewall and the supercharger screaming, a Thunderbolt could hit 550 miles per hour. The German fighters, optimized for turning, built light to maximize maneuverability, started shedding parts at 450. Their wings flexed, their control surfaces locked up, and their pilots watched in horror as the fat American fighters accelerated away like stones dropped from heaven. Major Walker Bud Mahurin was one of the first to perfect the technique. On July 16th, he spotted a pair of Bf-109s cruising at 18,000 feet, confident in their altitude and unaware of the 4 Thunderbolts loitering at 26,000. Mahurin nosed over, built speed until the airframe shook with compression, and closed the distance in seconds. The lead 109 never saw him. Mahurin's 8 guns converged at 300 yards, and for 2 seconds, just 2 seconds, he held the trigger down. 50 rounds per gun. 400 bullets in total. The Messerschmitt came apart. Not shot down, not crippled, disintegrated. The pilot never had time to bail out. Mahurin pulled back on the stick, and the Thunderbolt, 7 tons of steel and fury, converted speed back into altitude, climbing past 28,000 feet before the second 109 even realized his leader was gone. The German pilot tried to follow. He pulled back hard, dumping airspeed to climb, but the 109's engine choked at high altitude, starving for oxygen. He hung in the sky like a target at a county fair. Mahurin's wingman took him from above. Another 2-second burst. Another kill. The reports filtering back to Luftwaffe headquarters took on a new tone. Pilots described being ambushed from above by fighters they dismissed as slow and clumsy. The Americans weren't fighting fair. They weren't fighting German. The Wall of Lead. August 17, 1943. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. The bomber crews called it Black Thursday. 60 B-17s lost, 600 men dead or captured. The Luftwaffe threw everything at the raid. Single-engine fighters, twin-engine destroyers, even a few experimental rocket planes. It was a slaughter. But buried in the carnage was a revelation that terrified the German High Command. Major David Schilling led his flight of P-47s into a formation of Messerschmitt Me-110 Zerstorers, twin-engine heavy fighters designed to butcher bombers. The 110s were slow but deadly, armed with cannons and rockets that could tear a flying fortress apart from 1,000 yards. They were also completely defenseless against what came next. Schilling's flight dove from 28,000 feet. 4 Thunderbolts, 32 guns, 13,600 rounds of .5 caliber ammunition. They opened fire at 400 yards and held the triggers down until they were point blank. The effect was biblical. The first Me-110 absorbed 200 rounds in 3 seconds. Its right engine exploded, the wing folded, and the fuselage snapped in half. The second tried to evade, rolling hard left, but 3 Thunderbolts tracked it through the turn, pouring lead from multiple angles. The cockpit canopy shattered. The tail section disintegrated. What remained spun toward the earth, trailing smoke and body parts. Unteroffizier Hinrich Roth was the tail gunner in the 3rd 110. He survived because his aircraft was far enough back in the formation to watch the destruction unfold. In his debriefing, recorded by Luftwaffe intelligence and later captured by Allied forces, his testimony was chilling. "The American fighters came down like hammers from heaven," he said, voice flat with shock. "There was no warning, no radio call, just the sound, like tearing canvas, but 1,000 times louder. The aircraft ahead of us simply came apart, not shot down, destroyed, pieces everywhere. I saw Lieutenant Krebs's 110 take fire, and it was like watching a butcher at work. Metal peeled away in strips. The cockpit became a red mist. The whole aircraft just stopped being an aircraft and became debris." Roth's pilot tried to evade, diving for the clouds, but the Thunderbolts followed. His rear-facing machine gun was useless. He couldn't train it fast enough to track targets moving at 500 miles per hour. He fired blindly, hoping to scare them off. Then he saw the tracers. The P-47's guns fired 1 tracer round every 5 bullets, creating streams of light that converged from 8 barrels. To Roth, it looked like searchlights, 8 brilliant lines drawing together at a single point. That point was his aircraft. "I saw the tracers converge on our right engine," he recalled. "And then everything went white. I don't remember bailing out. The doctors said I broke 3 ribs when the parachute opened, but I don't remember that either. I just remember thinking, no human could survive that. No machine could deliver that much fire." The mathematics were simple and brutal.
Each .50 caliber machine gun fired 750 rounds per minute. 8 guns meant 6,000 rounds per minute.
At convergence range, 300 yards, where all 8 streams intersected, the P-47 created a cone of destruction 6 feet in diameter, filled with metal moving at 2,900 feet per second. A 2-second burst put 200 rounds into that 6-foot circle, enough to saw through an engine block, enough to disintegrate a wing spar, enough to turn a cockpit into a slaughterhouse. The German pilots had been trained to respect the punch of a 20mm cannon. A single shell could cripple a fighter. But 8 50 calibers, firing simultaneously, delivered more kinetic energy than 2 20mm cannons. And unlike cannons, which carried 120 rounds and ran dry after 15 seconds of firing, the Thunderbolt could sustain fire for 30 seconds. 30 seconds was an eternity in combat. Luftwaffe tactical manuals began including new warnings. Avoid extended engagement with P-47 formations. Their sustained firepower is unsurvivable. The death of an ace. October 8, 1943. 28,000 feet above Brno, Czechoslovakia. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp was not supposed to die that day. Men with 206 victories didn't die in routine missions. They retired to training commands, wrote memoirs, gave speeches to fresh-faced cadets about glory and sacrifice. They became legends while still breathing. But the sky at 28,000 feet doesn't care about legend. Philipp led his Staffel in Focke-Wulf 19s, hunting for American bombers penetrating deep into Reich airspace. The altitude was extreme, higher than most engagements, but intelligence reported the B-17s cruising at 26,000 feet, so Philipp climbed to intercept. His FW-190 fought him the entire way. The engine, optimized for low and medium altitude, gasped for oxygen. The supercharger screamed in protest. The controls felt sluggish, mushy, as if he were flying through syrup. At 28,000 feet, his fighter, so deadly at 15,000, became a compromise. Still dangerous, still lethal, but no longer supreme. Then he saw the Thunderbolts. They were above him, 32,000 feet, maybe higher, cruising in loose formations that seemed casual, almost lazy. Philipp's tactical mind processed the geometry instantly. He had the bombers below, the Thunderbolts above, and his own fighters struggling to maintain altitude. The equation didn't favor him. He transmitted a warning to his pilots. Achtung, Indianer high and north, maintain altitude and prepare to... The Thunderbolts doved. 8 of them, dropping from 32,000 feet like anvils, building speed so rapidly that Philipp's threat warning felt useless before it left his lips. He saw the lead P-47, Robert Johnson's, though he'd never know the name, pull into a 70-degree dive, the big fighter accelerating past 500 miles per hour. Philipp tried to evade. He rolled right, shoved the stick forward, attempted a split S that would trade his precious altitude for speed and maneuverability. But at 28,000 feet, his FW-190 responded like an arthritic old man. The roll was slow, the dive was shallow, and the Thunderbolts closed the distance in seconds. Johnson opened fire at 400 yards. The other 7 P-47s followed. their combined firepower creating a storm of lead that filled the airspace where Philip's Staffel had been flying. Philip's wingman died first. His 190 caught fire and tumbled. The pilot slumped in the cockpit, killed by a .50 caliber round that punched through the canopy and his skull in the same instant. The second FW-190 took hits in the engine and fuel tank, exploding so violently that the shock wave rattled Johnson's canopy. Philip jammed the throttle forward, desperately trying to dive away, but his fighter had nothing left to give. The engine sputtered, the airspeed barely climbed, and the Thunderbolts with their massive P&W R2800 engines and turbo superchargers designed for exactly this altitude ran him down like wolves chasing a wounded deer. Johnson's second burst walked across Philip's left wing, shredding the aileron and punching holes in the fuel tank. The third burst hit the cockpit. Philip's canopy shattered. His instrument panel exploded in sparks and smoke. A .50 caliber round, just one out of hundreds, entered through the side of the fuselage, ricocheted off the armor plate behind his seat, and severed his spine. He was dead before his fighter entered the clouds. The man with 206 victories, the holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, the mentor to a generation of German aces, fell from the sky over Czechoslovakia because his fighter couldn't breathe at 28,000 feet, and the Thunderbolt could. When the combat report reached JG-54's headquarters, the duty officer stared at it for 10 minutes without speaking. Finally, he picked up the phone and called Berlin. "Philip is gone," he said quietly. "Jumped by P-47s at high altitude. He couldn't climb fast enough to engage, couldn't dive fast enough to escape." The voice on the other end asked what the duty officer recommended. "Stay below 20,000 feet," he replied. "Above that, the sky belongs to them." The Paddle Blade Revolution, January 1944. Republic Aviation Factory, Farmingdale, New York. The engineers at Republic had been studying the combat reports for months. They understood the problem. The P-47 was king at altitude, deadly in the dive, unmatched in firepower and survivability. But German pilots had learned to avoid those scenarios. They stayed low, forcing the Thunderbolts to descend into turning fights where weight became a liability. And while the P-47 climbed well for a heavy fighter, it still couldn't match a Bf-109 or FW-190 in a vertical race from ground level. The solution arrived in the form of a propeller. The Hamilton Standard paddle blade propeller looked absurd. 4 massive blades, each one wider at the tip than the standard prop, creating a disc that seemed too large for the nose. Test pilots joked it looked like they were flying behind a barn door. But when they fired up the engine and pushed the throttle forward, the jokes stopped. The new propeller transformed the P-47's climb rate. What had been adequate became exceptional. The 4 wide blades grabbed the air with authority, converting the R-2800's 2,500 horsepower into vertical thrust with ruthless efficiency. A P-47D with the paddle blade prop could climb at 3,120 feet per minute from sea level, matching or exceeding most German fighters. The tactical implications were staggering. The first paddle blade P-47Ds arrived in Europe in February 1944. Pilots noticed immediately. The fat American fighters weren't just diving from altitude anymore. They were climbing to meet the Germans in vertical fights and winning. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, a 33 victory ace with JG-11, recorded his first encounter in his diary on February 19th. Engaged 4 P-47s at 15,000 feet. Attempted to climb above them for advantage. They followed. I pushed my 109 to maximum climb, expecting to outdistance them as always. They stayed with me. At 22,000 feet, one of them pulled alongside and waggled his wings, mocking me. Then he pulled up and away, climbing faster than I could match. I dove away and disengaged. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year. By March, the reports multiplied. German pilots described a new sound, a deep, rhythmic thunder that echoed across the sky when a formation of paddle-blade P-47s opened their throttles. Some called it Donnerschlag, thunderclap. Others simply called it the sound of inevitability. The tactical advantage the Luftwaffe had clung to, altitude and climb rate, evaporated. Now, when German fighters scrambled to intercept bombers, the P-47s could climb with them, match them, and then use their superior firepower and diving speed to dominate the engagement. Jabo Terror, April 1944. A road junction 6 miles south of Caen, France. Oberst Hans von Luck commanded the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment with the confident efficiency of a career soldier. His truck columns moved at night when possible, dispersed during the day, and maintained strict camouflage discipline. His men were veterans of North Africa and the Eastern Front. They knew how to survive in hostile skies. But nothing prepared them for what came that April afternoon. Von Luck was riding in the lead vehicle, reviewing maps for the evening's repositioning, when his driver shouted a warning. He looked up and saw them. 8 P-47s, low and fast, sunlight glinting off their canopies as they lined up for their attack run. He screamed for his convoy to scatter, but the order was pointless. The trucks were locked bumper to bumper on a narrow road, trees on both sides, no room to maneuver. They were trapped. The Thunderbolts carried 2,500 pounds of bombs, 2 1,000-pounders under the fuselage, 5 500-pounders under the wings. But they didn't drop the bombs first. They opened with their guns. Von Luck watched the leader's wings light up with muzzle flashes. 8 points of fire that seemed to flicker and merge into a solid line of light. Then the tracers reached his convoy, and the world became noise and destruction. The first truck exploded, its fuel tank ignited by incendiary rounds. The second truck simply disintegrated, its cargo of ammunition detonating in a chain reaction that vaporized the vehicle and everyone inside. The third truck took fire through the engine block and cab, killing the driver and sending the vehicle careening into the ditch. Then the bombs fell. Each P-47 pickled its load in sequence, high explosive bombs that cratered the road and turned trucks into shrapnel. Von Luck's vehicle was thrown sideways by the shockwave from a near miss. He felt something hot slice across his arm, looked down, and saw blood soaking through his uniform from a metal fragment embedded in his bicep. The attack lasted 90 seconds. When the Thunderbolts pulled up and banked away, their engines receding into the distance, von Luck climbed out of his vehicle and surveyed the wreckage. 14 trucks destroyed, 37 men dead. The road impassable, the supplies lost, his regiment's logistics crippled for a week. He wrote in his after-action report, The American jog bombers attacked with systematic precision. There was no warning, no chance for defense. Our truck columns simply ceased to exist. The psychological effect on the men is severe. They fear the sky more than artillery. The P-47, optimized for high-altitude bomber escort, had found a second calling: ground attack. Its ability to carry heavy bomb loads, combined with its 8 machine guns and legendary survivability, made it a devastating close air support platform. German soldiers coined a term for the terror it inspired: Jabo fever, the paralysis that gripped units when Thunderbolts prowled overhead. By D-Day, the P-47 groups had transitioned much of their effort to ground attack. They hunted trucks, trains, tanks, artillery positions, anything that moved behind German lines. Luftwaffe fighters, already outnumbered and low on fuel, couldn't stop them. German ground forces learned to move only at night, hide during the day, and pray the weather kept the Americans grounded. It rarely did.